So welcome school leaders, instructional coaches, and teachers. I know a lot of you guys are really busy with preparing for the beginning of your school year, but we are so glad that you're taking the time to be with us this morning for this short little webinar. I'm Amy Havard with E3 Alliance, and my colleague, Teri Clement, is here with me today as well. We're excited to share some ideas and build some understanding around the concept of accelerated learning for all with you today. The experience of leading schools over this past year has left us forever changed, and we know that opportunity gaps for students have widened, compelling us to reach for innovative, transformational practices to meet their needs. Teri has added a link in the chat to the resource page that has the recording and the slides for part one of this webinar that we did back in June. So some of the content that we'll start with today will be a little bit of a review or a refresher. We just wanted to refresh that content for those of you who joined us back in June, or maybe share it for the first time with those of you that are joining us today and didn't see the June recording. But also today, because we were focused more specifically on what this looks like in the classroom, we are going to go a little bit deeper with some of those examples we alluded to back in June, and go a little bit deeper with some of the classroom strategies that you can use to accelerate learning for all. Later this week, we will be adding the slides and the recording of today's webinar as well to that same link. So make sure you save that link so you can get back to it later this week. And of course, we will share a follow-up email to everybody who attended today with that link as well. So again, Teri and I are joining you from E3 Alliance. At E3 Alliance, we support schools and leaders in the work of transforming education systems through data and collaboration so all students succeed. We've worked alongside school leaders for many years, including this last one, which was a doozy, and we've developed a set of perspectives and strategies that will help us meet our mission. Accelerated learning for all is going to be a critical component of student success for the 2021-22 school year, and that's why we're inspired to share these ideas with you today. So what are we going to actually talk about this morning? We're going to start by defining accelerated learning for all, then look at what it means to accelerate, what we actually have to actually focus our acceleration efforts on, and then lastly, looking at when and how we accelerate. So designing those accelerated lessons and looking at classroom structures that make it possible. But first, let's go into what it means when we say accelerated learning for all. It does not mean to go faster. It's important that we don't mix it up with other words as we adapt these science of motion terms to the work of educators. For example, speed, which is your pacing, how much learning will happen over a period of time. Then velocity, which is the speed of learning in a particular content or category. That's the direction that learning takes. And that means that acceleration synergizes both of these ideas into one, with the notion that we adjust them according to the learning objectives and the student needs. So not just going faster, but thinking about our pacing and how much learning happens over time, while combining that with the idea of velocity. What direction are we going in a particular content? And that leads us to accelerated learning for all. So what actions or specific work is involved? When we accelerate learning for all, we narrow the focus to only those most critical standards and then find opportunities to pre-teach vocabulary, background knowledge, skills, or anything else students need before regular instruction occurs. Acceleration makes core instruction more accessible and therefore more likely to be effective for students the first time, ensuring school leaders and teachers are working smarter, not harder, to help students recover from unfinished learning and avoiding the trap of constantly having to intervene or reteach throughout the year. As we deepen this understanding about accelerated learning for all, it helps to consider what kind of thinking we'll need to change or move away from. So when you're leading acceleration, you're leading instruction with an acceleration mindset, that means you're transforming your thinking to look forward instead of backward. For example, use time that would previously have been spent on remediation to prepare students for new grade level instruction. Instead of reteaching standards that have been missed in the past, pre-teach to the standards that students need now for this grade level. Now that we're all on the same page about this concept of acceleration for all, let's look at how. What do we need to do to make this happen? So I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Teri to talk to us about how we make accelerated learning for all happen in our classrooms.
Thanks, Amy. We definitely want to start with looking at what do we accelerate. And as Amy noted, we did share some of these strategies that I'm going to review with you now, kind of taking a deeper dive into exactly how the work of a leader in the classroom, a teacher, a facilitator of learning would work either in collaboration with instructional leaders or colleagues to really narrow the focus and determine what to accelerate, what content to accelerate. When teachers are looking ahead and as we get ready to start this school year, we want to think about preparing to recognize all the content that's in a course. You want to study and select standards to accelerate so that your instructional plans are focused on the right content, on the most critical content. Beginning by examining the entire course and selecting those standards that are most essential within each unit for mastery of the course of a whole. The quantity of standards must be narrowed strategically, so you can use an accelerated instruction approach to amplify the learning. Although it varies with your specific schedule and pacing, a typical accelerated learning plan would be centered on 8 to 10 standards for the entire year-long course. Often, our first attempt to select the critical standards, like the one modeled here, will result in too many standards to be effective. Like this example, where there are 13 essential standards. What strategies can we use to narrow the focus even further and ensure we're making the right selections? Once the most essential content standards have been selected by unit, the next step might be evaluating which of these is the most aligned to readiness for success in the next grade level. In our example, 10 of the 13 standards were directly linked to readiness in the next grade level. Another filter that you could use is to look at which of them are most vertically aligned, and also which ones are most aligned to college, career, military readiness standards, really keeping an eye on big picture as far as our course and its experience for the students in the big picture of their whole trajectory. So considering these things will really help us filter and make decisions along with conversations with colleagues and collaboration to really narrow down our focus. And this would get us to that target number between 8 and 10 of reasonable standards. Let's look at a more specific example. These are all of the standards, content standards for the 7th grade math course here in Texas with the Texas standards. There are 47 standards. And if I'm focused on accelerating for all, I do want to select 8 to 10 at the most to reasonably accelerate. Which of these do we accelerate? First, the originators of this curriculum have already set a designated set of focus standards known as readiness. This means that these standards are essential to success in the next grade level. And typically standards designated as readiness in this set of standards, they necessitate in-depth experiences. They address broad and deep ideas, concepts, and they can also be shown to support post-secondary readiness. If we narrow our goals for accelerated learning for all with the readiness focus, That gets us down to 13 standards, which is much more reasonable, but it's still too much. Remember, we're trying to aim for 8 to 10. With these 13 readiness standards already arranged into 9 units of study, this team of collaborators, these 7th grade leaders in the classroom, they could really use collaboration and really other resources to study these standards even deeper and try to narrow the focus. As we start to work toward the goal, it looks like maybe having 1 per unit might be a reasonable goal, although it doesn't always work out that way. But looking at vertical alignment even deeper, using supplemental resources, again, those deep conversations, and sometimes even maybe some tense conversations, some disagreement, but remember that grows us as well. So it's important to make sure you can bring in collaboration to this process as much as possible. But when we look at those, we see that in our example units, unit 1 and 2, they already are kind of focused on 1 each, and they both have strong alignment to that next grade level. For unit 3, 7.4D has a stronger alignment after being studied to that vertical concept, what's coming in the following grade levels of 8th and 9th. As well, I can see that 7.4A continues to be an essential standard in the following unit. So selecting 7.4D as the focus for Unit 3 and 7.4A as the focus for Unit 4 acceleration is the way to go. This is supported by further comparative analysis of 7.4A and 7.7A. I know that's a lot of 7.7s, but the idea is that this deep study and this comparison of standards will help you narrow that focus each time. This analysis continues as collaborators focus even more. And even though we've gotten it down to 12, it's better, but it's still too many. So other considerations include the data available, frequency tables for how often students are asked to demonstrate readiness on certain standards. All of these can help you reach for and make further decisions about really making a focused list of standards for accelerating the content for all. Also, a curriculum resource can really be helpful in helping you determine which ones align most with that end goal of narrowing your focus so that you can effectively accelerate the instruction. Another helpful way to think about this narrowed set of standards is to think about this question. If I asked you as you're getting ready to plan and teach a course, the question is, what are the 8 to 10 standards that all of the students from that course should master to be successful in that course and beyond? That and beyond is super critical because you want to think about not just where students are at when they're with you in that school year, but where have they been and where are they going next? Does your list of selected standards provide a reasonable and strategic answer to that question? If the answer is yes, then you are ready to accelerate. And in this example, these are the 9 skills that if I was having conversations, I would say, yes, these are the 9 skills that all 7th grade math students in my class would need to continue on to success. And these are the things we want them to remember, to demonstrate mastery of, and be able to successfully recall when they get to the beyond, which is the following grade levels. Once we've been able to select that critical content, we do need to think about what's next. When and how do we accelerate? And more specifically, how do we design lessons around that critical content to ensure that learning is focused in the right direction? We want to share with you 4 types of accelerated lessons. Those are activating prior knowledge. This is where we review learning from previous units or maybe even previous courses. Provide experiences. Sometimes there is no prior knowledge to activate and we have to work to insert that. So we definitely want to keep that in mind as a possibility for acceleration for our students. If something is brand new to your students, then previewing those concepts is a great way to accelerate. Look for ways to make cognitive connections during the preview. Explicit vocabulary instruction is a fantastic way to accelerate, because when students have the words that will be used in the learning and they're ready to go, then they can join the conversations that happen during that learning. Teaching them vocabulary ahead of time can be a very effective accelerant. Let's look deeply at this first type of an accelerated lesson, activating prior knowledge. This is where we really want to reach and see, do the students have some experience, something we can build on and really leverage as we begin to prepare to go into some new concepts or some new learning. Some examples include brainstorming. For instance, in a English class, before you begin a genre on poetry, you could have the students brainstorm a chart of everything they know, either on the wall or in a shared virtual workspace, everything you know about poetry and how it's different from other types of texts. A fifth grade teacher could also use a fourth grade graphic organizer from a vertically aligned concept. So if fourth grade solved problems with perimeter and area, that's 1 and 2 dimensional measurements, then the visuals and the graphic organizers that those students used in the previous year could be brought into the instruction ahead of the fifth grade unit, vertically aligned in that area. I do have an asterisk there, because we can't always assume that that prior knowledge took place. Sometimes, even though something is vertically aligned, we think, oh, well, the students surely learned that last year, but then you're kind of making some assumptions about what they've been able to retain and what their exact experiences were. And especially after the year last year, I don't think we can assume any of that necessarily happened, and being able to retain it, of course, will be an even more challenging thing because of the levels of stress and everything that we experienced with some of the school disruptions last year. One more great idea for really activating that prior knowledge is thinking about students' knowledge that's fairly common. So things in pop culture, music, current events, things that have been discussed in the classroom even the day before. If there's some way to anchor the types of thinking around those things to the learning that's coming up, and leveraging that in an accelerated lesson ahead of time, like Amy said, to really get ahead of it, then that would be a fantastic approach. The next type is providing those actual experiences. This is where we would reach for scaffolded learning from vertically aligned standards, demonstrate things in a lab or video viewing, or actually doing something hands-on that could be a predecessor to going deeper into conceptual understanding. And this will often be a need for any students who struggle with retention for various reasons. So thinking about previous year's learning, using a video clip or a cartoon panel to practice explicit and implicit inference, for instance, can be a great way to get those muscles activated, those thinking muscles about how we make an inference, and practicing them in a more narrowed, shorter focus ahead of the actual deep conceptual lessons that are coming in the upcoming unit can be a very effective way to provide an experience that can serve as background knowledge. Or perhaps even a hands-on lab. Like I mentioned before, if fifth grade students are getting ready to really engage in learning about volume, three-dimensional measurement, then having some sort of hands-on experience with perimeter and area ahead of that would be a great way to really accelerate their learning. The next type is previewing concepts, and that is where we would use visuals and media, really previewing a concept and giving them a way to think about it ahead of the initial beginning of the actual unit of study can be a great way to really give them time to process the ideas involved with the initial exposure to a concept. And that way, when the unit starts, perhaps the following week, then their ideas have already had time to process and start to grow. Some great ideas of that are taking abridged versions of text, using visuals, media. Also, another great way is picture book sharing. There are a lot of picture books that can serve as establishing a schema or a way of thinking ahead of actually applying the more complex thinking of a concept. The example I've shared there is a great book called Fly on the Ceiling that has ideas about Cartesian planes and coordinate planes in math, but it's sort of a fun way to introduce that concept, which when applied in mathematics becomes a little more complex, but there's a layer to add it to. And then finally, that explicit vocabulary instruction, I would say a really important strategy here is to select the words directly related to that most critical content and really plan for meaningful interaction with the words. We don't really want students to passively look up words necessarily. We want to have them interact and use those words in speaking, reading, writing, listening experiences. So I would say definitely reach for things that are meaningful and have a sort of another layer to them as far as students using the vocabulary that they've just been introduced to and their definitions. There's some examples here that I'll go deeper into when we do a deep dive into a lesson in just a moment. The deep dive that I wanted to share with you is the idea of using an analogy to really anchor something that students already know or are familiar with to something you need to introduce to them, a brand new idea. The visual that I've provided here is just sort of a quick reference guide to Piaget's cognitive development theory. Again, I've probably described something like this already, but the idea is that you establish some schema, some way of thinking that's already existing, a practice of understanding with the students, and then you use that schema to put new information sort of into it or upon it, and then carrying that through and really giving the students an experience to assimilate that new information into their schema is this amazing cognitive development process that can really make a difference for students as they are learning new concepts, especially big ideas and complex concepts. I'm going to keep going further into this example. Before I do, though, the amazing thing about engaging something like an analogy is that it really hits all of those categories that I just mentioned, those types of accelerated learning. It can really provide all of these benefits. Let me show you a little bit deeper. The example I'm going to walk through is for 712A, another 7th grade math standard. It was on the list. So again, I've done a big study of the whole course. This is one of the standards that students would demonstrate to be successful in this course and beyond. A deep study of this standard results in kind of these distilled ideas that if students are able to compare two groups of numeric data using comparative dot plots or box plots, then that journey begins with a review and an awakening, an activation of what they know about box plots and dot plots already, and then building on that to go to the comparative realm, which is a higher order of thinking. So once I have distilled and focused on what students need ahead of time to be able to jump into that big concept actively, then I reach for what is something I can create an analogy to that would help them understand not only the structure of it, but how it can be used for comparative. So an existing schema that these 7th grade students in this example have is that there is a shared summarizing fiction strategy used in their ELAR classes. So this is a fairly common one called Somebody Wanted But So Then for how to summarize fictional texts. And the idea is by invoking that, by activating that knowledge, you can then connect what you want them to learn next first by thinking about what the characteristics of this are and then building from there. The way the sequence would go in this accelerated learning plan would be to first start with explicit vocabulary instruction. This example will have a triple play, which is an amazing activity found on a resource on leadforward.com. And then anchoring it to this activated understanding of a summarizing strategy that they've been using in this learning environment that they're very familiar with, and then using those ideas to connect it to a deeper understanding of what you can do with box plots and dot plots. So that would be the sequence of learning that we would want students to have accelerated and ahead of the unit of instruction. And I want to share with you one more resource that could help you when you're sort of looking at how this learning is designed. Again, the design of accelerated learning, and that is a unit plan. You can see that in this unit plan, the 712A that I just mentioned was selected as a critical standard. The acceleration begins at a certain date, and you'll notice that the actual unit doesn't begin until after that. So some idea of the pacing is indicated there, as well as the details of how that lesson gets planned. Just a couple of other quick examples. Here's another 7th grade math concept that involves really deeper concepts about the relationship between volume of prisms and pyramids. And I first distill what do students need to know that would help them going into that learning, and then some lesson opportunities listed there, which kind of hit those types that we mentioned before. Another example, again, at the 8th grade level, when we go to make inferences and use evidence to support understanding, that this particular genre is informational text. So ahead of time, the students could be introduced or activate their prior knowledge of the vocabulary involved in that learning, gain some clarity, understand the relevance for bringing that process of inference into the study of informational text, and then engage them in some different ideas for activities there for the lesson opportunities. It could be a video or more explicit vocabulary instruction within that genre. Just some ideas to share. All right, so now I have shared exactly how you could go about designing those lessons for accelerated learning for all students. And I'm actually going to ask Amy to share with you a little bit more, because we may be thinking, okay, these are instructional ideas, but where do they happen? How do you find time for them? And I'm going to ask Amy to share some ideas with you guys around that. Amy?
Awesome. Thank you, Teri. So yes, let's talk about when and how to accelerate. What kind of classroom structures can we start thinking about that would make acceleration for all possible? So in the first webinar back in June, we shared some possible times and environments where accelerated learning can take place. So to support and organize the work, you'll want to think about what's possible on your campus. So if you're a campus leader, you could take a look at your bell schedule for that you already have planned for this year and find any of those opportunities to build in accelerated learning. A lot of them are listed here, but there may be other ideas that you have that are more specific to your campus. But also thinking about those of us who are joining today that are classroom teachers, really focusing on those last 2 bullet points, because even without having the ability to change a master schedule or to, change what different structures are happening throughout the day for students, you can still find examples of when to accelerate in your own classroom. So what we're going to do is we're going to specifically take a closer look at those last 2 bullet points. How do we accelerate during whole group instruction on some scheduled days Or how do we accelerate during small group instruction that's happening in core classrooms? So first of all, let's talk about making time for accelerated learning in whole group instruction. And two examples of how to do that are Freshen Up Fridays, where you preview the next week, and acceleration days, where you take some time between units that's built into your pacing calendar. So let's look more closely at what I mean by Freshen Up Fridays. So the idea of a Freshen Up Friday is you've designated Fridays in your classroom for accelerated lessons. So Monday through Thursday, you're teaching your core content. Also focused on that essential standard that you selected as Teri previously talked about, but you've set aside Fridays to more specifically do some of those acceleration lessons and ideas that Teri shared with you. So what do we do on that Friday? Instead of accelerating for the upcoming unit, we're really thinking specifically about accelerating for the upcoming week. So I already have my next week planned out. I can go back and I can think about those 4 types of accelerated lessons and what is it that is going to make the learning next week more accessible for my students. So what might this look like during my classroom? I would have a 15-minute teacher-led mini lesson on whatever the concept or the idea is that I am trying to accelerate for next week. And again, that mini lesson could be one of those 4 types of accelerated lessons Teri shared, or it could be a combination of several of those different types of accelerated lessons combined into one. Then I would plan a 30-minute application time for my students. That might look like students working together in a collaborative group activity, or it might be an opportunity for me to hold individual or small group lessons or conferences with particular students that needed more support. But basically, as a classroom teacher, I could work in accelerated learning for all by reserving Fridays to freshen up for the next week. The other whole group option to think about if you're a classroom teacher is acceleration days. And that means really adjusting your pacing calendar so that you have 1 to 2 days between units where you can specifically devote those days to acceleration. Now think about it. Generally, a lot of classroom teachers that I know already have 1 to 2 days set aside between units. Typically, we use those days for test correction or reteach or something like that. But what Teri and I are saying is if you want to adjust your mindset to an accelerated learning for all mindset, that means starting already to look forward and to use those days you might have set aside to start making sure students are prepared, to making sure students have access to that upcoming unit by using acceleration lessons. So what does this mean? So immediately following the unit assessment, I would take a half day, a half class period to add that assessment to my data tracker, to reflect on our unit, to do any of those things that I want my students doing at the end of the unit. But then I would also take the other half of that day and the following day, so a total of 1.5 days to engage in those accelerated lessons or experiences that we previously talked about. Then after 2 days, I would begin my next unit. So students had a nice close and a reflection on the previous unit. They had some acceleration. They're ready to go. So that next unit, they should be able to have more access to the content and therefore more likely to master right away. Now, the second way we talked about, you might find opportunities within your own classroom for acceleration is by using small group instruction. So thinking about how you might structure your class with 4 small group rotations. And here's an example of what those rotations would be. A live teacher-led station, an asynchronous teacher-led station, a student collaboration station, and an independent learning collaboration. Let's look at an example of what these would be. So I'm going to give you just a moment to read through that example on your own before I talk through it. So you can see here that each station is designed to take about 20 minutes. And students would rotate each station once every other day. So they would have about 2 stations per day. So for each station, the content could be really flexible. So sometimes in those stations, students are working on the current unit, their core essential standards. And occasionally, maybe towards the end of your unit, you could utilize as a teacher some of those stations to start working in accelerated learning lessons as well. So what does this mean? Let's look at an example of that schedule. So you can see on here that every day of the week is accounted for. Monday through Thursday, students are working through their small group schedule. And then on Friday, that one is reserved for different purposes. That's a check-in day where students might be doing assessments or one-on-one conferences. So I'm going to give you just a moment to review that schedule. Think back to what you've seen on the previous slides about what each of those stations might be and where accelerated learning might be happening in each of those stations. So again, thinking back to the previous slide where we detailed out what each of these 4 small group experiences might be, you'll notice that throughout the week, each student group experiences a variety of different learning environments, and most of those learning environments are focused on the current unit of study. But you can see where the icon for acceleration is on a few of those stations. That's where the teacher is working in acceleration. And this might not be throughout the unit. Again, this might be towards the end of the unit during a week where acceleration is scheduled. So you can see that it takes place ahead of the next unit, and it generally takes place in teacher-led stations. So this is another example of a way for a teacher to integrate some accelerated learning lessons for all students, or for the students that are most likely to need it, without necessarily having to have extra time throughout your day or your schedule. So now that we've looked at accelerated learning for all, starting by defining it and what does it mean, Teri really took us through a great example of really thinking about what to accelerate and being very purposeful about selecting that critical content. Then Teri and I have showed you some different ideas about when and how to accelerate, both by thinking about what those accelerated lessons are and looking at some classroom structures that might work for you. So before we close out today, I do want to just pause and check the chat and check with Teri to see if anyone has any questions. If you have a quick question, feel free to post it in the chat. But I am going to check with Teri to see if any have come in through private chat. Teri?
Amy, I got one question. I think it was maybe applicable to all the sections, but the question was about how do you plan for pacing? Like, how do you adjust the pacing calendar for the year if you need those extra days? I'm thinking they were inspired by what you were talking about, the acceleration days and just all that entails. I guess I'll just ask you your ideas on that. I have a couple of ideas, but I'll ask you first. What are your ideas for what can I do now to look ahead pacing wise and make sure I have maybe those couple of days between each unit that I need for that accelerated learning?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I would start with, first of all, really thinking about what we are conceptualizing as a unit this year. So Teri you walked us through that great example for 7th grade math of how we really select those essential standards for the year. And not only is that great for acceleration, as we were talking about knowing what content to accelerate, but that also is a mindset you should take into planning for your regular units of instruction as well. So this year, year, knowing that we have students who will need more support, more scaffolding, more time on the most important concepts than they ever have before to really reach mastery, we can start by thinking about our pacing, by really making sure our units of instruction are focused only on the most critical content. So this has been a movement in education for years and years, but really thinking about no matter what state or what curriculum you follow, there are probably more standards, more objectives in that curriculum than you can reasonably ask students to master in any given period of time that we have during the school year. So one thing I would do is really start by looking at how to focus my units of instruction only on that most critical content, knowing that's going to help me with my pacing. So if I don't have to teach everything, if I really need to focus on the things that are most important for students to master this year, that's going to make my units more manageable. And that's going to buy me a little bit of time to work in accelerated learning lessons between units or during my small group within a unit. The second thing I would say is it's always a goal, and some of you guys out there are amazing at this, and some of you guys might be working on this as a goal, but it is very, very important if you're going to be doing accelerated learning for all to really be working and planning ahead. So having a goal of really having a unit map planned out several weeks before the start of a unit. So that doesn't mean that you need to know every single lesson you'll be doing that unit, but you've got that unit map that really tells you the critical content, the details underneath each critical content, which students have to master, and the pacing that you plan for that unit. So some people like to do a pacing calendar. Some people have on their unit map and they just assign particular, time periods. This concept's going to take me 3 days. This concept's going to take me 4 days. Whatever works for you in your planning, but to have that unit map planned out, that will give you a good idea of how to work in acceleration. And then on top of that, that also helps you begin to start planning week by week or whatever your method is to make sure you're planned several weeks ahead of time. So you can really be thoughtful about where to make those connections and where to put those accelerated lessons in. Teri, did I steal your ideas?
No, I think that's great. The only thing I might add, Amy, is just that a practice of aligned assessments throughout, right? Because if you're planning ahead with a very focused unit map and this critical content to accelerate in mind, then your assessments aligned to that learning will help you to be even more efficient and effective when it comes time to give those assessments. And by the way, I'm sort of referring to the unit assessments, but also the formative for checking in along the way. I think that just really sharpening your assessment practices are going to help you with the pacing, because sometimes we can get bogged down. I think you mentioned this when you were going over the acceleration day, is to, really energize those days with student self-reflection, student self-monitoring, and then get them also to take advantage of looking forward to accelerate their learning. No, but that was, I think that was our only question for today. But thank you, Amy. Thank you so much. Amy, want to close us out?
Sure. Just again, want to remind you guys that the link is in the chat to the recordings and the slides from our first webinar back in June. And then again, later this week, we will add today's slides and today's recording to that same link as well. So definitely save that link so that you can go back to it later if you want to either review what we've talked about today, or you want to share this webinar or these slides with others that you think might find this information useful. And then, as always, we want to say thank you so much for being with us today. We understand this is a really busy time of year, so we appreciate the time that you've devoted today, that commitment to your students to figure out what this accelerated learning for all is all about, and coming to learn a little bit more about how you can make that happen in your classroom. We have provided our email and our website here, so please reach out if you have any questions, or check out our website, because there will be, of course, this and lots of other resources that might be useful to you as you are prepping for your new school year. And please don't forget to tag us in your social media posts if you have anything to say about accelerated learning for all, or throughout the year, if you take any pictures of student work or lessons that you're planning, We'd love to see those. So definitely tag us in your social media posts at E3 Alliance. Teri and I, again, just one more time, want to say thanks for being with us this morning. And we are sending you lots of good energy for a strong start to the 2021-22 school year. Best of luck, everyone.